Bob, it's very interesting. Donald Trump was blasting pundits who were opposed to his decision to abandon the Kurds and abandon our allies in that volatile region. And yet, going back to what Lindsey Graham said after it happened, he said Lindsey's exact quote was that it was a, quote, stain on America's honor. And that is, of course, as you know, that is a feeling that is shared by most Republicans on Capitol Hill, even if they aren't saying it out loud like Lindsey.
On today's front page of the Washington Post, my colleague Toulouse Olorunipa and I dig into the Republican scene right now and how it's not about the media outcry about Syria. It's about the Republican outcry on Syria that dynamic is changing the Republican relationship with President Trump as we speak. Because when I'm on Capitol Hill right here, steps away, they're saying to me privately, top Republicans, they were with the president and still with him publicly on the impeachment front. But the Syria issue has broken up a new opening for them to criticize this president. And then when they watch him at his news conference, that cabinet meeting of sorts yesterday, they become alarmed, and they're talking to each other about maybe a new establishment type chief of staff needs to be installed. Something needs to be done. They're not breaking fully with him, but they're worried about him and how they can hold on with this president for another year ahead of 2020.
You know, David Drucker, it's fascinating. You listen to people and they'll go, well, isn't it strange that this is the issue that that separated Republicans from Donald Trump? No, not really, because this issue is one of the most critical decisions, not only of this presidency, but I would say it is the most critical, damaging decision that the United States has endured since George W. Bush decided to go to a war in Iraq, because what's at stake here? Donald Trump has helped Assad, who's murdered 500,000 people and caused an unprecedented refugee crisis across the Middle East and the world. He has ceded the region to Vladimir Putin and the Russians. He is going to help reconstitute ISIS. And of course, he has now given the Iranians a shot to have that land bridge to where they've desperately wanted the land bridge to. Hezbollah and other terror groups that can continue to terrorize Israel. Who has he hurt? Well, he's hurt Israel. He's hurt the Kurds, who are most loyal allies. And he's hurt our allies across that region. Like, this is a big issue. This is a monumental mistake. So it does make sense that Republicans are upset. How are they dealing with this a week later, seeing all the chaos before them?
Right, and it's not going away, Joe. It's striking to me how Republicans have reacted to this in a way that they did not and have not been reacting to the impeachment inquiry. In talking to Republicans over the past couple of weeks, sure, there are concerns about where the inquiry could go, and yes, it's another Trump scandal, if you will, that they're having to deal with. But they did not have that much concern about the long-term political ramifications of impeachment in and of itself. This Syria issue is a whole nother matter. I mean, this gets to the heart for so many Republicans, especially in the Senate, but also we've seen in the House, for what they believe in the kind of foreign policy the United States needs to prosecute. Not only is there long-term concern about the damage to the U.S. standing, especially regarding how we deal with our adversaries in Beijing, Tehran, and Moscow, but just the fact of a diminished U.S. influence that can cede ground to a lot of these countries that would like to run things a whole lot differently than we do. And in talking to them, it makes it harder, they will tell you, to defend him on the front lines of impeachment, which they actually, in a way, want to do, or they're at least willing to sign up for that. And while Republican aides have talked privately, Republican senators have been very open, and Republican senators that often go out of their way not to criticize the president. So I think for a lot of people that have focused on what Mitt Romney had to say, not insignificant, and a couple of others, I mean, in interviews over the past week, you've seen Mitch McConnell, you've seen John Thune, you've seen Marco Rubio, senators that had gone out of their way to just sort of, yes, Trump is Trump, I'm not going to get in the middle of that fight. And so we've seen over the past few years, foreign policy is the one area where they've been willing to jab at the president. We saw it in 2017 with legislation, veto-proof in a Republican Congress to prevent the president from making deals with Putin without congressional sign-off. But they are just perplexed. Of everything I've seen them deal with when it comes to Trump, where they've been upset, they've been angry, or they've raised their eyebrows, I think this is the biggest faux pas that they have seen. And it's the policy and the posture that has left them concerned.
So another new poll out this morning shows that half of Americans support President Trump's impeachment. According to the latest CNN SSRS poll, 50% of Americans said that Trump would be impeached and removed from, should be impeached and removed from office, up 3 points since last month. 43% disagreed. That's down 2 points. Now, those who support impeachment include 6% of Republicans, half of independents, and 80% of Democrats. Moving on, those numbers echo the latest New York Times Siena College poll that put support for the House impeachment inquiry at 50% of voters in Pennsylvania, Florida, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Arizona. 45% say they oppose.
And John Meacham, we've talked about this before, but these numbers make it all the more striking also. When you look at those polls and see how closely they match up with the Fox News poll from last week that had 51% of Americans believing that Donald Trump should not only be impeached, but that he should be removed from office. It wasn't until the very end, when the tapes came out and all of the information came out about Richard Nixon, that Americans bolted away from Nixon the way they did. This is happening now very quickly after the Ukrainian revelations, and one suspects those numbers for independents are only going to go higher.
Yeah. You know, they were late to leave Nixon, and they never left Clinton, which is interesting. If I were in the Trump White House, that would be a really striking thing to ponder, that I don't think the polls ever got there with President Clinton. Happy to be proved wrong. But his approval rating, I think I'm right, had almost never been higher than on the day he was impeached. You know, two things. I think one of the truest sentences spoken in the past 10 days or so in American life was by Speaker Pelosi when she said, "All roads with you lead to Putin." All roads lead to Putin, and they all lead to Obama with President Trump. And those are the archetypes in his head. I think we should be pretty candid, it seems to me. You can't tell what's in someone's heart. But the fact that Barack Obama was an African American who became president and became a pretty popular, relatively popular president, and that Donald Trump rose to power in this nationalist phase as someone questioning the legitimacy of that president, I think is one of the reasons he returns to that trope when he's in trouble. Because he thinks that of that 43% or so who don't want him impeached, some significant portion of those folks have a similarly impervious view, an inflexible view of Barack Obama. And I think we should be honest about that, because if we aren't honest about it, we can't fight against this struggle we have, perennial struggle we have between our better angels and our worst instincts. The opinion is movable on this, it seems to me. And I would also say that in this hyper-partisan age, 50% that would have been 60% in the old days. And so when you get 50% of Americans to agree on anything, that's a pretty remarkable number.
It really shows that people understand. They're doing the math here. They understand what's right and wrong here. And that, I think, was a little bit lost in the Mueller report, given how long it took for it to come out, how many pages it was, and what the Republicans were able to do, including the Attorney General. In this case, the White House has admitted to it. The Chief of Staff has admitted to it. They put out a memo admitting to it, and people are going, no, that's wrong.
And it's being driven right now by Democrats and independents, at least 40% of independents, only 6% of Republicans, and that number is going to have to get higher, and I suspect it will get higher as time moves on. But, you know, Mike Barnicle, Ed Luce had a column last week where he was talking about it was actually along the same lines of what Nancy Pelosi said, that all roads lead to Putin. Everything always goes back to Putin. And Ed Luce with the Financial Times said that Roman judges used to always have a question. It was cui bono, who benefits? Who benefits? If Republicans are scratching their head over the Syria decision, the Kurd decision that undercut Israel and helped rebuild ISIS, then ask the question. The Roman judges would say, who benefits? The answer is very clear. Vladimir Putin. Yeah. Vladimir Putin, for the first time in 1973, for the first time since 1973, Russia has a foothold in the Middle East. That foothold grew exponentially stronger with Donald Trump beating a speedy retreat out of Syria and doing absolutely nothing to check Russia's power there. Who benefits? Assad, who Vladimir Putin has been propping up for years now, even though he killed 500,000 people. The Russians actually bombed 4 hospitals within a 24-hour time period. Hospitals with patients in them, reported the New York Times. Who benefits? Putin, because Assad now, as Ed Luce points out, cements power in Syria. Who benefits? Putin, because Turkey, whose leader Erdogan is going to Russia, Turkey now builds a closer relationship to Russia. And as Ed points out, it just may be that Turkey will decide to leave NATO. They've been a member in name only anyway, and actually create a strategic partnership with whom? France? No. Germany? No. With Vladimir Putin. Who benefits from all of this? Vladimir Putin and Russia. Nancy Pelosi was right. All roads lead back to Putin.
It's chilling.
And as we speak, Joe, today, the last day of the supposed ceasefire or pause, whatever you want to call it, the pause concludes today at the end of the day. Putin and Erdogan are meeting in Sochi right now, today. And the numbers that we showed about impeachment, there's such volatility in the American electorate. The numbers, 50%, I don't know. I don't know about those numbers, given the volatility of the American electorate. But Susan Page, let me ask you, when you put impeachment on the table and you talk about Putin and the impact that he has had on this country, on our elections, and on clearly the President of the United States, what do you hear in Washington about a theme that I hear a lot about from talking to people in Washington, and it is this, that one of the big negatives that weighs upon elected officials, even Republicans, is the President of the United States seemingly slowly stripping away at the credibility and character of the American commitment in the globe, around the globe.
You know, you really hear, Mike, some weariness on the part of the president's defenders. And I think this is something that President Trump himself is recognizing. I think one reason he reversed himself on having the G7 summit at his own resort in Miami is because he realized he really needs his defenders to defend him on impeachment more. So he gave up something that they were not defending him on. And one of the things that strikes me about these poll numbers is the velocity of the change. You know, it was only a month ago this week that the Washington Post reported that there was a whistleblower complaint that the House Democrats wanted to get a hold of. And in that space of time, we now see 50% of independents saying they support not just an impeachment inquiry and not just the impeachment of the president, but his removal from office. That is really an extraordinary change. And one last thing, when the president's defenders talk about impeachment, they tend not to defend him on the actions that he is accused of taking. They defend him on process, that the impeachment inquiry isn't fair, that there aren't attorneys allowed, White House attorneys allowed, that Republicans aren't getting a fair chance to answer questions, that there's not a public, that we don't know who the original whistleblower is. That is a bad sign for the president as you look ahead to what we are sure will be public hearings probably next month on this impeachment inquiry and a vote likely to take place in the House in December.
And Bob Costa, on this question of impeachment, the stated explicit plan from the White House, as you know, was to stonewall the investigation. They wrote it in a letter that was made public and sent to Congress. We're not going to give you anything. But that's not working. because Fiona Hill has gone up and testified. Ambassador Yovanovitch has gone up and testified. Gordon Sondland has gone up and testified. And this morning at 9:30, the leading diplomat in Ukraine at the time, Bill Taylor, is going to be on the Hill. Bill Taylor is not one of President Trump's lackeys. He's not a hotel guy who gave $1 million to the inaugural campaign. He's a graduate of the military academy, served in Vietnam. He's served under a number of presidents, a serious guy who likely is going to sit down and tell the truth. And you'll remember that Bill Taylor is the guy who said it was, quote, crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. He wanted to say, the Russians will love it and I will quit.
Turns out many of the administration officials, people who work in the national security space, they're not following Mr. Cipollone's directive or signing on to his letter. Many administration officials who are talking to the Post and others say they don't want to defy a congressional subpoena because they want a career after President Trump is gone and they want to protect their own reputation and integrity. So they're willing to sit down, and they expect more top officials to sit down and put their hand in the air and uphold the Constitution and tell the truth. The challenge for this White House right now is not only on the legal and congressional front, it's also on the political front. I can't tell you the number of text messages, phone conversations from Republicans who say this president is a one-man war room, and he's not communicating any kind of strategy to congressional Republicans who want to defend him. The Freedom Caucus group who was there ready to go on the barricade for him, but they don't really know what all the facts are and what the White House wants them to say day to day. Instead, it's the president himself at the fore, railing against the media, lashing out against President Obama, criticizing others, and not giving his own party a strategy and a playbook.
You know, David Drucker, you wrote a fascinating piece about what happens if Donald Trump stays, but the Republican Senate actually goes because they're threatened by impeachment. And it's a brilliant insight and something that nobody's looked at, just like nobody looked at Republicans doing as well as they did in 2016, winning, actually holding seats in a presidential election year in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania. Nobody saw that coming. But with Joni Ernst in a state where Trump's upside down by double digits, Cory Gardner, probably one of the most threatened incumbents that's up in 20, along with Susan Collins in Maine. Of course, Martha McSally in Arizona. She's going to be in for a really tough fight in Arizona. Her opponent has more money on the hand than Joe Biden. Go to North Carolina, Tom Tillis. Tom Tillis may be okay, but you can never be sure. If it's a really rough year for incumbents in the Senate, Tom Tillis could be swept out to sea. So talk about that scenario.
Well, I think what I'm not sure everybody on all sides of this appreciates, it's how uncertain impeachment is for everybody. I think it's something Mitch McConnell recognizes, and it's why he'd like to get this thing off the table before they get too deep into 2020, if it were up to him. And so, while there's a lot of pressure on Democrats because they're the ones that are making the case, and they're the ones that are going to have to convince the American public that the case for impeachment is solid and warranted, for Republicans who have felt like Democrats were over their skis and risked blowback, especially in difficult swing districts, there's a chance, because of how the Senate map is laid out, Colorado, Arizona, North Carolina, where Tom Tillis is facing a tough primary, and possibly some other battleground states, where all of a sudden the Republican Senate majority, which looked pretty firm, starts to get itself into trouble. Why? In part because if you're Cory Gardner or you're Martha McSally, on the one hand, a vote for protecting President Trump in an impeachment trial to acquit is the kind of thing you want to do to keep the Republican base happy. And yet it's the kind of thing that sends a message to general election voters that you don't have enough distance from the president, a president that a lot of these voters disagree with and are probably going to vote against. And you end up in this no-win situation. And so the bullets in impeachment could fly in all sorts of directions, and a Republican Senate that did not look in particular danger could all of a sudden start to be in real trouble if the Democrats can lay out a case against the president that is compelling and it comes out like that in a Senate trial. You're not going to get the votes to remove the president from office. You're simply not going to come up with 20 Republican senators, in part because all of these senators, so many of them are from states that are supportive of the president, but there are just enough vulnerable Republicans in enough of these battlegrounds that it starts to be problematic. There are a few Democrats in states like that as well. Doug Jones in Alabama, possibly Gary Peters in Michigan, depending on how the politics of 2020 play out. But I think Republicans could be in more peril than they believed heading into the impeachment inquiry. And I think as Susan mentioned, there's a reason why Republicans are focused so much on process. It's because there is enough associated with what the president has said in that call alone that is problematic.
Yeah, you're right, David. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
and
you,
boy,
David.
A great insight that when you get to impeachment, the political bullets do fly in all directions. There is no planning it out. David, thanks so much for being with us, as always. Hope to see you again soon. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.